still small voice cries.
Hey everyone, it's MK. Welcome back. So today's video was born out of some techniques that I was using on a quilt in my studio this week. Basically, it was a quilt where I was doing some block-to-block placement. Now, I was going along just fine, but I realized what I was doing was a lot of mark, stitch, over and over again. And then I got to thinking, why am I not using the duplicate feature? If you've taken one of my classes, my online classes, you know that we use duplicate a lot. We use it in combination with area and alignment when I'm working on my layouts. But when I'm at my quilting machine, I don't actually use it all that much. Well, that changed this week as I had kind of an aha moment. So what I want to do is take you into simulation. I'm going to kind of talk you and walk you through the quilt that I was working on, and I'm going to show you the technique that I was using to make my stitching and marking go a little bit quicker. So let's go inside the simulation and then I'll meet you right back here.
All right, where I thought we would start today was talking a little bit about the baseline function. All of us pretty much, I'm guessing, work with baseline when we work with a pantograph application. So here's a pattern that I use a lot in my online classes, and it's just called Twist Feather. It's a Jessica Schick pattern, and it comes free with our Pro Stitcher. So when we work with pantographs, and we know that pantographs are a point-to-point pattern, and we go and do our repeating, and we depress point to point, we can see that Pro Stitcher indeed hooked them together. And if we open up our single button over here, which opens up the list of patterns, we can see that yes, Pro Stitcher has connected those together, and it's made it one repeated pattern. But until we depress baseline, it's not truly one continuous pattern without those start and stop points. So that's one application for baseline where it can help us group things together, especially on a point-to-point pattern, and get rid of those start and stop points so that we're just dealing with one new pattern. What I want to show you next is another application for using baseline, and it relates to duplication and grouping. All right, so let me just talk you through what I have on the screen. This is a layout that I did for a quilt that I was working on in my studio this week. And I'm going to be sharing some more information and some pictures of this quilt actually stitched out later on this year when I get permission from the quilt's owner. So you're going to want to stick around for that. But for our purposes today, what we want to talk about is this inside border right here. This was a pieced border. And I had decided to use these two different blocks, this flower block and this 4-square block. Now, these are not point-to-point patterns, so I was duplicating them and placing them down individually. I'm going to pull up the layout, and I'm going to talk you through, first of all, showing you how I did the layout for this border in simulation. Then I'm going to talk you through how I was stitching it on the top and how I had a light bulb moment by the time I got to the sides and the bottom. All right, here we go. This is just the round of that pieced border. These squares are 4.5. I have 13 of them across. If you do the math on that, that gives you the figure for our area box, which is 58.5 by 58.5, and I just centered my line drawing inside of the box. And remember, you guys, the line drawing is just for visual reference. It's nothing that I plan to stitch. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with our first pattern. It is this little French braid design. Let me just drag it down here on the screen so that we can see it a little better. And I'll do a select all and refresh. That's always our friend in simulation. All right, let's go ahead and select that pattern again. There we go. And it's already been pre-sized to 4.5. Now we're just going to go ahead and repeat it. How many do we need? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We need 7 of them. So let's just go ahead and repeat it. Let's repeat 7. We know the distance between that is 4.5 because I just told you that and we measured our quilt, right? So let's just align it to the center and to the top. And let's refresh again so we get this back on our screen. Pan down a little bit. All right, let's do the exact same thing with the other block. Now remember, you guys, these steps that I'm showing you right now are just for layout, okay? You guys know that I love doing layout and rendering, which basically means I'm using my simulation to get a layout for this quilt. Now, these steps, in the way that I'm placing them and grouping them together and repeating them, and all of those steps, those are not necessarily how I'm going to stitch it out. And we're going to talk about the stitching out process next. Okay, on to the next block is this little 4 square block. Again, I've already pre-sized it to 4.5. I know that I need 6 of them. I know the distance apart is 4.5. And if we just go into our alignment function and we align it to the center and to the top, there we can see that we have kind of a pretty picture, our layout of how this border is going to work. Now let's talk about the grouping and the baselining. If we select our button right there and click on just the single box, it will show us what we have open. Here's my line drawing. We're not really concerned about that right now. But what we're going to do is we're going to switch this button to multiple, and we're going to select these 2 repeated settings that we did, these 2 repeated sets of the pattern. Now, I'm going to actually hit baseline right now, and what you're going to see is that took those groups of patterns and it made it into one grouping. Okay, and I might go ahead and call that border top, or whatever you want to name it, whatever makes sense to you. And I'm going to save it, not because I'm going to stitch it that way, but because I like to save things. And if I was working on a quilt that I was actually creating a border that was a point-to-point border, I probably would stitch it that way, and I am going to need it later at my quilt, so saving is a very good step. Okay, I have this border built. Well, this border is basically going to be the same border as down here. So now comes our duplicate function. Again, remember, this is just layout and rendering. So we're just using these duplicate and alignment features just to get this pretty picture of what our quilt layout is going to look like. Now, I'm going to stop here, and I'm not going to fill in these other borders. I want you to try this after class with some blocks that you have in your collection. Go ahead and do the same thing on the side borders. Build your borders with however many repeats you need, and then practice those alignment functions. What I want to do now is move on and talk to you about how I actually stitched these at the quilt. How I did the first row of them was not how I did the second row. I kind of had an aha moment by the time I got down here to the bottom, and I want to share that with you. All right, here we go. What you guys need to do now is pretend that you're standing at your quilt. This quilt is loaded, and I have stitched everything already on the top part of this quilt. And now I've gotten to this row, and we're ready to stitch. So here's how I did it on the top part of my quilt. I just went through those patterns one at a time. First, the little French braid pattern, and again, I'm just going to drag it down here so that we can see it. So we'll do a select all and refresh. That's our friend. All right, so what I did with that pattern open and my quilt loaded is I just brought my machine into position on this square and started doing my multi-point marking so that I could mark, and I did 4 marks in there. I might have done more. It depends on the block. If I needed to do more marks, I would do more marks. But for now, we'll just do 4. Make sure that we reselect the pattern. If you were actually working at your quilt, the pattern would stay selected. It's just that when I work around in simulation, sometimes it deselects that pattern. Okay, so the pattern is selected. Our area was created. And then I went to skew and align, skew to it. I do a baseline. Now the baseline in that particular case is kind of like a snapshot. It just takes a quick save of what we just did. And then I like to save, I already mentioned that, and I would maybe just call this block 1. I like to save anything that I've skewed, and if you've taken one of my online classes, we talk about that a lot. All right, so I've skewed it, and then I would stitch it. That's how I did it to begin with on this top row. And I basically worked from left to right, and I just filled all of those blocks in, okay? I'm not going to take the time to let that stitch out, but you get the idea. I would just, when that one was done, I moved across to the next one. That one was going to be a 4 square block, so I opened up that little 4 square. And again, it just jumps off the screen when we're working in simulation. We'll do a select all and a refresh. And I did the exact same thing. I went over here and I marked that block by block, and I stitched it out block by block. All right, that's a perfectly fine way to do it. There's nothing really wrong with doing it that way. But by the time I got to the bottom, I realized that if I just opened that pattern once, duplicated it, then those patterns would be open on my screen. I could just go ahead and do all of my marking at one time, do all of my skewing while I was standing there, save it as a grouping, and then I could stitch. So it went a little bit faster for me by the time I got down here. So let me just show you those steps. All right, again, pretend all of this area has been stitched in. We're down to this next round of our border. Here's how I handled it on the bottom. I started again with my little flower unit, but instead of going immediately to my area and marking and stitching, I went to my duplicate feature. I already knew I needed 7 of them, so I just had it open on the screen and I started hitting duplicate. Now it's popped off the screen, but I'm actually just going to leave it up there kind of hanging in thin air. Doesn't really matter where it duplicates or where it appears on the screen, just matters that it did indeed duplicate. Now watch this list over here as I continue to duplicate. So there's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, the ones that I duplicated, the first one's at the top, the rest of them followed along the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to leave this list of patterns open now as I go and start doing my area. This time I started in the middle of the quilt so that I could place and stitch them working out from the center. And I just thought that might have been a better plan to ease in and accommodate for any of that draw up that happens in the stitching process. So if I look at this, I would need 1, 2, 3, 4. Here is where I would want to start doing my multi-point marking. So I'll come down there, make sure again 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep, that's where I need to be. And I'm just going to do my multi-point marking. Same basic idea as before. My pattern is selected and I'm going to skew and skew 2. I'm going to baseline to get that quick capture of what I just did. Now I'm going to move on to the next pattern that I duplicated. So again, if that closed down, just hit the select button and your list of patterns will come up. Now, one really quick note. Because I baselined this flower right here, that flower moved from the top of the list to the bottom. So that's just kind of a little tip to know that when you baseline, your patterns move to the bottom of the list. All right, so let's jump back up to the top and let's select the next one that we had duplicated. All right, that pattern is selected. Now we're going to move into position. Let's go ahead and mark our area. We'll clear the first area and we'll begin marking the rest of these flower patterns. All right, it's already selected. We can do skew and align. We can do skew 2. We can baseline to capture what we just did. We can go back and select the next one on the list. There it is. We can go to our area and clear the area. Now, on the quilt that I was working on, just a little tip before I move past this step. I had already stitched a small sashing unit here. I had done some stitching in the corners over here, and I had done a sashing row beneath this border. So my row of pieced blocks right here was pretty stabilized by the time I began to do this stitching. One thing that you're going to have to watch on your particular quilt is a couple of things. How high is your loft on your batting? How dense is your pattern that you're stitching? Some things like that are going to make a difference as far as how many of these you actually place down and stitch at one time. I was actually able to go ahead and place all 7 of these flowers before I stitched, okay? And when I went ahead and stitched them out, they all maintained their placement just fine. They stitched out perfectly. I was very happy with it. But again, in another situation on a different quilt using different type of a batting, you may want to place and stitch maybe just 3 or 4 of them at a time and then move on. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fast forward through this and I'm going to place the rest of my blocks and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the baselining and the saving. Okay, here we go. Basically, in that amount of time, I just went ahead and multi-point marked all of my flowers. I got them all skewed individually. I have my select box open with my single box revealed, and now I can see again all of the patterns that I have open and placed. Here are all the ones at the bottom, all of these flower units that I placed. Now before I go ahead and stitch, I want to select multiple, and I want to select all of those units. I don't want to lose all of that stuff, all of that time, all of that marking, all of that skewing that I just did. I don't want to lose that. So I'm going to go ahead with all of the patterns selected. I'm going to baseline. That's going to make it a grouping. It doesn't matter if these other patterns stayed open. That's a different situation that we'll talk about in another video perhaps. But if the patterns that were originally open remain on the list, that's fine. All we're really concerned about is the new grouping. I might call this my bottom flower grouping. And again, I'm going to want to save that before I stitch. Now, the reason why I'm saving that grouping, let's say that I stitch these flowers and at some point I have a little snarl in my bobbin or something happens and I need to pick out stitches. Again, I can just go pick out a few stitches. I can open up my bottom flower grouping. I can skip to the appropriate start point. I can get myself repositioned and I can stitch out a flower that perfectly matches the one that I did before. If I failed to save that and I tried to go back and pull up a flower, it's going to be slightly different, isn't it? If I pulled up the main flower, the master flower, and I tried to stitch it in this area, that flower is not going to be skewed the same as the first time I stitched it. So that's why I feel it's very important to get into the habit of saving everything that you skew so that if you have to go back and fix something, you've got exactly the same version as you had when you stitched it. Okay, so I would go through and stitch these flowers. After these flowers had been stitched out, I went back and I filled in those other 4 square blocks. Now, I guess I really technically could have laid out this whole row and stitched it all, you know, after I had placed everything down, but I chose to do one set and then the other set. So that's just a really quick tip on how I was handling a block-to-block placement this week and using the duplicate function and the baseline and using that merging into a group was really saving me time when I went to stitch this out. All right, guys, I hope that has been helpful. Till next time. Bye-bye.
So there you go. Has it got you thinking a little bit differently about baselining, about duplicating, about making groups as you go along to help your stitching go quicker? I hope so. It really, really helped me on the quilt that I was working on this week. As I close today, I want to ask you another question. Have you been watching these videos and have they been really helpful to you? Well, I really hope so. Well, one of the things that I really want to let you know is that this whole thing that I'm doing, I kind of call it the MK way. It's not really the only way, obviously. You know, I come across things, I come across techniques as I'm just working every day in my studio. But it's not the only way, it might not be the best way. So here's my question for you. Do you have other ways that you do things in your studio? Would you like to be able to share them with other people who follow the MK page or my SimStyle group? I would love to work with you, to collaborate, if you will, on bringing you into my studio one day and helping me with a video. Because you know what? We all learn from each other. And I know a lot of us are visual learners, so these YouTubes are perfect for that. But if you have something that you do in your studio that you would love to share with the rest of us to help us learn and know our machines better, shoot me a private message or send me an email at melissa@mkquilts.com, and maybe you'll find yourself in one of my next videos. And believe me, I will give you full credit for what you're sharing because I feel that that's very important. So until next time, everybody, from my studio to yours, happy quilting. Bye-bye. So I'm taking on the end of this video to give you a couple of invites. First of all, I have 2 in-shop training sessions coming up next month in Washington State. And I have a huge event coming up in November here in Florida. I am going to be hosting Kelly Klein from the Quilting Vintage fame. I am so excited about that event. So what I want you to do is hop over to MK Quilts, that's mkquilts.com, and check out all the details for my in-shop classes and my event in the fall. I hope you'll join us. I'll see you there. Bye-bye.